I didn't go looking for the truth. It found me. It started with a strange gut feeling that I brushed off at first. Jenna, my wife of 8 years, had been acting differently, distracted, too glued to her phone. But I thought maybe it's just work stress or something. I didn't want to be that guy, accusing her without proof, so I let it go. I thought I was being paranoid. That was until the day I got a call from Ryan, an old buddy who worked as a private investigator. He'd done some work for me years back on a business dispute. I hadn't spoken to him in a while, but when he called, his tone was serious. He asked if we could meet. I met him at a quiet diner outside of town. He had a folder in his hand when he walked in and slid into the booth across from me. I'll never forget how he looked at me. It wasn't pity exactly, but it was close. "You sure you want to see this?" he asked. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. He opened the folder and laid it out. Pictures, timestamps, receipts. There she was, my wife, smiling like she hadn't in years, leaning into her boss at a fancy rooftop bar I'd never even heard of. More pictures followed, each one worse than the last. His hand on her thigh. Her leaning in to kiss him. The dates lined up with nights she'd told me she was working late. I stared at the photos, my stomach in knots. The air felt too heavy to breathe. Ryan just sat there quietly, giving me time to process. "I didn't know how to tell you," he said finally. "But I couldn't sit on this, man. You needed to know." I nodded, my throat tight. "Thanks, Ryan. I owe you." He shook his head. "You don't owe me a thing. But what are you gonna do now?" I didn't have an answer for him. All I knew was that the life I thought I had wasn't real anymore. The woman I thought I knew wasn't the same person. And there was no going back. I drove home that night feeling like a ghost. The house, usually a place of warmth, felt cold and foreign. Jenna was already in bed when I walked in, her phone on the nightstand, screen face down. She murmured a half-asleep "Hey, you okay?" before rolling over. I just stood there, staring at her. The woman I'd built a life with. The woman I thought I'd grow old with. How many lies had she told me while lying right there in our bed? "Yeah," I said finally. "Just tired." She didn't respond, already drifting back to sleep. Meanwhile, I couldn't even blink. I stayed up all night, sitting in the living room, staring at nothing. Thoughts ran circles in my head. Anger, heartbreak, disbelief. Then came the plans. If she could lie so easily, what else could she do? I had to protect myself, my future. The next day, I skipped work. Instead, I called a lawyer. Her name was Karen, a no-nonsense type who listened as I explained everything in a flat, detached voice. I handed over the folder Ryan had given me. "You've got everything here," she said, flipping through the pages. "This makes things simpler, at least." "Good," I said. "What do I need to do?" She leaned back in her chair, studying me. "Do you want a clean break? Or are you looking for a bit of leverage?" I hesitated. The old me, the guy who trusted Jenna blindly, might have said clean break. But now I wanted her to feel what she'd done to me. "Leverage," I said. Karen nodded. "Then you'll need to start moving your assets. Quietly. Don't confront her yet. Act like everything's fine." "Can you do that?" "Yeah," I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. "Good. This is going to take time, but we'll get everything in order." I left her office with a plan and a strange sense of calm. The storm wasn't coming yet, but I could see it on the horizon. At home, Jenna was in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone. She looked up when I walked in, smiling like nothing was wrong. "How was your day?" she asked. "Busy," I replied, grabbing a glass of water and avoiding her eyes. She went back to her phone, completely unaware of the distance that had grown between us. And I stood there, watching her like a stranger, wondering how much longer I'd have to pretend. The days that followed were a masterclass in acting. I smiled when I wanted to scream, shared meals with her when I could barely eat, and kissed her goodnight when the thought of touching her made my skin crawl. Every lie she told, every "I love you," every work meeting excuse, felt like another nail in the coffin. But I needed time. I needed patience. Karen and I worked fast. She helped me open a new account at a bank Jenna didn't know about and transfer my direct deposits there. I started cataloging all our joint assets, the house, cars, even the stupid coffee machine she loved so much. Everything went into a spreadsheet. I wanted no surprises when the time came. I also reached out to a real estate agent in my hometown, letting her know I'd be moving back soon and needed something small. Just for me. Jenna thought I was just stressed from work and making trips to clear my head. In truth, I was laying the foundation for my escape. But the hardest part wasn't the planning. It was the pretending. One evening she came home late, smelling of perfume that wasn't hers. She kissed me on the cheek and asked if I'd eaten dinner yet. I wanted to grab her and demand answers. Instead, I smiled and said, "Yeah, I made pasta." "Sounds good," she said, heading to the bathroom. "I'll heat up leftovers." I sat there, staring at her untouched plate. She had no idea I already knew. No idea I was preparing to blow her perfect little world apart. And then, like fate wanted to test my resolve, she asked me to plan her birthday party. "It's a big one," she said over breakfast one day. "I thought we could do something special. Maybe invite the whole family? Some friends?" "Sure," I said, masking the disgust curling in my stomach. The idea took root almost immediately. A party. Everyone there. Her boss included. It was too perfect. A public stage to let her lies crumble in front of everyone. That day I made a list. Decorations, food, music, and at the very bottom the ultimate surprise, her betrayal served cold. Planning Jenna's birthday party felt surreal, like walking through a dream where you know the ending is a nightmare. Every detail I arranged wasn't for her happiness, but to set the stage for her humiliation. I started with the guest list. Jenna had a tight circle of friends, her family, my family, and of course her co-workers, including her boss, David. The man I'd seen in those photos. Just the thought of him being in my house, laughing and eating my food made my blood boil. But that was the point. He had to be there. Who should we invite? I asked her one evening, sitting on the couch with a notepad in hand. I kept my voice light, casual. She looked up from her phone, smiling. "Well, definitely the usuals. And maybe David." She hesitated for a second, then added, "He's been so supportive at work lately." "Supportive?" "Sure." "Of course," I said, scribbling his name down. "I'll make sure he feels welcome." She smiled, oblivious. "You're the best." The rest of the planning fell into place quickly. I booked a caterer, rented some decorations, and even splurged on a cake from her favorite bakery. Every decision was laced with bitter irony. This wasn't just a party. It was a performance. Meanwhile, I kept up my act at home. I didn't want her to suspect a thing, so I leaned into my role as the devoted husband. We went out to dinner, watched movies, even took a weekend trip to the lake. She thought everything was fine. But at night when she was asleep, I'd sit in my office, piecing together the final touches of my plan. I had Ryan dig up more dirt on David, just in case I needed leverage. Karen was working on the legal side, ensuring I had everything in place to walk away clean. And then there was the recording. I spent hours scripting what I'd say. It had to be perfect. Enough to expose her lies without making me look like a monster. I'd record it and let it play during the party, ensuring everyone heard the truth. It was cruel, sure, but so was what she did to me. By the time the party rolled around, I was ready. Jenna had no idea she was walking into her own downfall. The morning of Jenna's party, I felt strangely calm. Everything was in place, the food, the drinks, the decorations. The playlist Jenna had painstakingly curated was ready to go. I even double-checked the recording one last time, listening to my own voice describe her betrayal in cold, precise terms. Jenna was in a great mood, humming to herself as she got ready upstairs. She called down to me, asking if I'd hung up the banner she insisted on. I told her I had, and she laughed, saying I was the best husband ever. I smiled to myself. If only she knew. By mid-afternoon, the first guests started arriving. Her parents came in, carrying a bouquet of flowers and a bottle of wine. Her mom hugged me, telling me how lucky Jenna was to have such a thoughtful husband. I nodded, biting back the words sitting on the tip of my tongue. Lucky, huh? Friends trickled in next, filling the house with laughter and chatter. I played the gracious host, making sure everyone had drinks and snacks, all while keeping an eye on Jenna. She was glowing, bouncing from group to group, oblivious to the storm brewing under her feet. And then David arrived. He walked in with a bottle of champagne, his hand resting lightly on Jenna's lower back as she greeted him. My jaw tightened, but I forced a smile, shaking his hand like I didn't already know. He seemed relaxed, confident. He had no idea. The evening wore on and I waited for the perfect moment. I wanted everyone to be settled, happy, unaware. Jenna had just finished cutting the cake, laughing as someone smashed a piece into her face. She wiped it off with a napkin, leaning against David for balance. That was my cue. I stepped into the center of the room, holding up my glass to get everyone's attention. "Hey everyone," I said, smiling. "Can I have a moment?" The chatter died down and all eyes turned to me. Jenna beamed, assuming I was about to give some sweet, loving toast. In a way, I was. "I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for being here tonight to celebrate Jenna. She's worked so hard this year and deserves all the love in this room." There were nods and murmurs of agreement. Jenna smiled at me, her cheeks slightly pink. "And because I love her so much," I continued, my voice steady, "I thought it was the perfect time to share something special. Something she's been keeping from all of us." I reached for the remote, my heart pounding as I hit play. The room fell silent as the video started playing. I could see the confusion on Jenna's face, her brows furrowing in confusion. She opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand, silencing her. This wasn't the time for her to play the victim. The screen lit up with a grainy shot of a bar. It was David, leaning in close to Jenna, whispering something into her ear. I'd made sure to include every moment, the shared drinks, the flirtatious gestures, and of course the kiss. Jenna's face went white as the video continued. She looked around the room, her eyes darting from me to David to our friends, all of whom were watching in stunned silence. There was no denying it. It was all right there. As the video played, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. The years of doubt, of suspicion, of her lies were all coming to a head. No more pretending. No more second-guessing myself. And then, just when I thought it couldn't get any worse for her, the video shifted to a moment from the night she told me she was staying late for work. There she was, walking hand in hand with David, laughing together like a couple. The date on the screen matched the night she had assured me everything was fine. Jenna finally found her voice, though it was shaky and weak. What is this? What are you doing?" I didn't respond at first. I just let the video run its course, making sure everyone saw the full picture, the pictures, the texts, everything. When it ended, I stood there, watching her crumble. Her eyes welled with tears and she stumbled back a few steps, shaking her head in disbelief. She turned to David, her voice rising, her hands trembling. "David, tell them it's not true. Please." David looked back at her, his face a mixture of guilt and shame. He didn't say a word. The room felt like it was suffocating. The truth was out, and there was nowhere for her to hide anymore. "Well," I said, my voice colder than I ever intended it to be. "Care to explain?" Jenna's shoulders shook as she tried to compose herself, but it was clear she had no defense. I didn't mean for this to happen," she said, her voice cracking. "It was a mistake. It meant nothing." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "A mistake? You called me your best friend, your partner. You said you loved me. And this is what you do. You betray me with him, right under my nose." She tried to walk toward me, but I stepped back, holding up my hand. "No. This isn't something you can apologize for. You've ruined everything. You lied to my face for months. For what? Because you didn't think I'd ever find out? Or maybe because you didn't care." Her lips trembled, but she said nothing more. She looked like a child who had been caught stealing, helpless and broken. David shifted uncomfortably, looking between us. But when he spoke, his words were clear. I never meant for this to happen. I'm sorry, man. But it did, and I can't undo it." I turned to face him, my anger flaring once again. "You're sorry? You've been sleeping with my wife and all you can say is you're sorry? You've had no respect for me, for our friendship, and now you're sorry? Well, it's too late for that. Jenna's face was pale, her body rigid as she stood there, frozen in place. She didn't know what to say, how to fix it. And at that moment I realized there was no fixing it. There was nothing left between us. The silence in the room was suffocating, like everyone was collectively holding their breath. Jenna's friends exchanged uneasy glances, her parents looked stunned, and David stood there like a deer in headlights. No one knew what to say or if they should say anything at all. I wasn't done. I've been working on this for weeks, I said, my voice steady. While you've been sneaking around, I've been making sure I wouldn't be blindsided. I've moved my money, consulted lawyers, and prepared for this exact moment. Jenna's eyes widened. Lawyers? What do you mean? What are you saying? I'm saying it's over, I replied. I'm filing for divorce. Everything has been set in motion. She took a shaky step toward me, tears spilling down her cheeks. Wait, please. Let's talk about this. Don't do this here. Not like this. Please. I shook my head, my resolve unwavering. Why not here? You didn't care about the people in this room when you lied to me, cheated on me, and disrespected everything we built. So why should I spare you the embarrassment now? Her hands flew to her face as sobs racked her body. She turned toward her parents, pleading, Mom, Dad, say something. He's blowing this out of proportion. Her mother looked at me, her face full of heartbreak. Is this true? She asked softly. I simply nodded. I've got all the proof you need. Ask her. Ask David. Jenna's father shook his head, stepping closer to her. Jenna, how could you do this? What were you thinking? I wasn't thinking. Jenna shouted through her tears. I was lonely, okay? I made a mistake, but it didn't mean anything. I love him. I love you, babe. Please don't do this. I laughed bitterly. Love? You don't get to say that. Love doesn't look like this, Jenna. Love doesn't lie, cheat, and humiliate. You destroyed it. David finally tried to interject. Maybe we should all cool down and talk this through privately. This isn't the place for... Shut up, I snapped, cutting him off. You're part of the problem. You don't get a say in how this goes down. David's face flushed, but he wisely kept his mouth shut after that. The room remained tense, everyone caught between sympathy for me and shock at Jenna's betrayal. I scanned the faces of the people who had come here expecting a celebration, and instead found themselves in the middle of a train wreck. I'm leaving, I announced, setting my glass down on the table. I've packed my things and made arrangements. Jenna, I'll have the papers sent to you. I hope you enjoy the life you chose. Before she could respond, I turned and walked toward the door. I heard her call my name, her voice desperate and broken, but I didn't stop. For the first time in months, I felt free. I stepped outside, the crisp night air hitting my face like a cold slap. The sound of muffled voices carried through the door behind me. Jenna's cries, David's stammering, the murmurs of confused guests. I kept walking, letting the noise fade with each step. My car was parked a few streets away, deliberately out of sight. I'd planned this moment carefully, knowing I'd want a clean exit. The sidewalk stretched ahead, quiet and empty, the streetlights casting long shadows. My footsteps echoed faintly, the only sound besides the faint hum of the distant party I'd just left in shambles. For a moment I slowed, looking back toward the house. It was tempting to glance inside to see what was happening, but I knew better. Whatever came next was no longer my concern. That chapter of my life was over. Sliding into my car, I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles whitening. The adrenaline was still coursing through me, leaving my hands shaking slightly. I sat there for a moment, staring out at the dark road ahead. It was strange, I thought I'd feel triumphant, victorious even after exposing the truth. But all I felt was a hollow sense of relief. The weight of Jenna's lies was gone, but so was the life I thought we were building together. I had won, but at a cost I wasn't sure I could fully grasp yet. Taking a deep breath, I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, cutting through the stillness of the night. Without looking back, I drove away from the house, the neighborhood, and the life I was leaving behind. The taillights faded into the darkness, taking me closer to a new beginning. The drive to my hometown was long, the quiet hum of the engine the only thing filling the void. I thought the distance might help me feel lighter, like leaving the scene of the betrayal would somehow cleanse me of the weight of it all. But as mile after mile passed, the ache in my chest stayed, stubborn and persistent. Every so often I glanced at the passenger seat. It was empty now, but for years Jenna had been there beside me, singing along to the radio, laughing at bad jokes, or just holding my hand in the silence. I couldn't help but wonder if those memories would ever stop feeling like they belonged to someone else's life. When I finally reached my destination, the sun had just begun to rise, casting a pale orange glow over the streets of my childhood. It had been years since I'd been back. The town looked smaller somehow, quieter. Or maybe I was just seeing it through different eyes. The apartment I'd rented wasn't much to look at, a modest one-bedroom at the edge of town. The paint on the walls was faded, and the carpet had definitely seen better days, but it was clean and quiet. A place to start over. I parked in front, grabbed my bag and stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was how empty it felt. The furniture I'd arranged to have delivered was there. A small couch, a dining table with mismatched chairs, a bed frame waiting to be assembled. But it didn't feel like home. Not yet. I stood in the middle of the living room, letting the quiet settle around me. There was no sound of Jenna moving through the house, no faint buzz of her phone notifications, no smell of her perfume lingering in the air. It was just me now. For better or worse. After a few minutes I started unpacking. I wanted to keep busy, to avoid thinking too much. I put my clothes in the closet, hung a few photos on the walls, and set up the kitchen with the few dishes I'd brought along. Every item felt like a piece of a puzzle I was trying to put back together, one that might never look the same as it did before. Later that evening I sat on the couch with a beer in hand, staring out the window at the quiet street below. The apartment was dimly lit, the faint hum of the fridge the only sound. It was a stark contrast to the chaos I'd left behind at Jenna's birthday party. No lies, no tears, no betrayal, just silence. I thought I'd feel relief being here, but mostly I just felt tired. Tired of pretending, tired of hurting, tired of carrying the weight of what she'd done. The betrayal wasn't just about the affair. It was the loss of trust, the shattering of something I thought was unbreakable. How do you even start to rebuild after something like that? But then I remembered the reason I left. I wasn't here to dwell on the past. I was here to start over, to figure out who I was without Jenna, without the life we'd built together. It wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in a long time, I had the freedom to try. That night I slept on the bare mattress, wrapped in a blanket I'd brought from the old house. It was strange, lying there in the dark, with no familiar sounds or scents to lull me to sleep. But it was mine, this space, this life. It was a small step, but it was the first one towards something new. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was streaming through the blinds, and for a moment I forgot where I was. Then it hit me. This was my life now, simple, quiet, mine. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel like I was drowning. The days after my arrival were a whirlwind of small, mundane tasks. At first it felt strange, almost surreal, to be in a place where no one knew about the mess I'd left behind. This town didn't care about Jenna, David, or the disaster of that birthday party. Here I was, just another guy moving into a quiet apartment trying to start over. I threw myself into the basics, unpacking boxes, buying groceries, and setting up the place to feel a little less like a temporary shelter and more like a home. I started small. A few houseplants by the window, a second-hand rug for the living room, a coffee maker that was a splurge but worth it. It wasn't much, but it was a start. My favorite part of the apartment was the small balcony that overlooked a quiet street. I found myself sitting out there most evenings, nursing a beer and watching the world go by. Couples walked hand in hand, kids rode bikes, and neighbors chatted across fences. It was peaceful, even if it made the ache in my chest a little sharper at times. This was the life I thought I had with Jenna, the life I'd hoped to build. The town had changed since I was a kid, but not as much as I expected. The bakery on Main Street still sold the same cinnamon rolls I used to beg my mom to buy, and the park near my apartment still had the same creaky swings. It was comforting in a way to know some things hadn't changed. One day I stopped by the local diner for lunch. It was a small place with checkered tablecloths and a menu that hadn't been updated in years. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with a warm smile, greeted me like an old friend. "Haven't seen you around before," she said, pouring me a coffee. "New in town?" "Sort of," I replied. "I grew up here, but I've been away for a while." "Just moved back?" She nodded knowingly. "Looking for a fresh start, huh? This town's good for that." Her words stayed with me. A fresh start. That's what I'd come here for, wasn't it? To leave the pain and betrayal behind, to figure out who I was without Jenna, without the life I thought we were building together. It wasn't easy, but the simplicity of the town made it feel possible. Despite the progress I was making, there were still moments when the weight of everything hit me. At night, when the apartment was quiet and my thoughts had nowhere to hide, memories of Jenna would creep in. The way she used to laugh at my terrible jokes. The way she'd sneak up behind me to steal a hug when I was cooking dinner. The way she'd hold my hand and make me feel like we could face anything together. Those memories felt like ghosts, haunting the edges of my new life. I hated how much space she still took up in my mind, even after everything she'd done. But I reminded myself that healing wasn't a straight path. Some days would be harder than others. To keep my mind occupied, I started looking for work. My old career didn't feel right anymore, not in this new version of my life. I wanted something simpler, something that wouldn't remind me of the person I used to be. I put in applications at local businesses, even considered working at the hardware store near my apartment. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. One afternoon, as I was tidying up the apartment, my phone buzzed on the counter. It was a number I didn't recognize. I hesitated, debating whether to answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hello." "Hey, it's Jenna." My stomach tightened at the sound of her voice. It was soft, hesitant, like she wasn't sure she should have called. "What do you want?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. I wanted to see how you're doing. I know I have no right to ask, but I've been worried about you." Her concern felt like a slap in the face. Worried? She was the one who had destroyed everything. I didn't owe her anything, not an update, not forgiveness, not even a conversation. "I'm fine," I said flatly. "Don't call me again." Before she could respond, I hung up and blocked the number. My hands were shaking as I set the phone down. The call stirred up emotions I wasn't ready to deal with: anger, sadness, and a deep sense of betrayal that still felt fresh, no matter how much distance I put between us. But as I sat there, staring at the blank screen, I realized something. I didn't need her closure. I didn't need her to explain herself again or try to fix what she broke. My healing didn't depend on her. It depended on me. That night, I stood on the balcony, looking out at the quiet street below. The air was cool, the stars bright against the dark sky. For the first time since I left, I felt a small glimmer of hope. This was my life now. Simple, quiet, and mine to rebuild. It started with a text. "Hey, can we talk?" I stared at the message for a while, unsure how to respond, or if I even wanted to. After everything, what could she possibly have to say that I hadn't already heard? Still, a part of me was curious. Did she want to apologize? Explain? Beg? None of it really mattered, but the thought lingered in the back of my mind. I left the message unanswered, but Jenna didn't stop there. Over the next few days, more texts came through. "I miss you. Please let me explain. I know I don't deserve it, but I need to say something." I ignored them all. Every notification felt like a small jab, a reminder of the life I'd left behind. Blocking her would have been the logical choice, but for some reason I couldn't bring myself to do it. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was a lingering thread of the love I used to feel. Or maybe I just wanted to see her squirm a little. Then came the voicemails. "Hey, it's me. I don't even know where to start. I know I hurt you and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know how sorry I am. Please call me back." Her voice cracked at the end, and for a brief moment I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. A few days later, an envelope showed up in my mailbox. No return address, but I recognized her handwriting immediately. I opened it, my heart pounding against my better judgment. Inside was a handwritten letter, pages of her pouring out every thought she apparently couldn't bring herself to say over the phone. She wrote about how much she regretted what she did, how she had been lost and made terrible choices. She said David meant nothing to her, that it was a stupid fling, and she never stopped loving me. The words blurred together as I read, my anger bubbling to the surface. A fling. That's how she justified months of lying, sneaking around and tearing apart our marriage. By calling it a fling. By the time I got to the end where she begged for another chance and said she'd do anything to fix this, my hands were trembling. I crumpled the letter into a ball and tossed it into the trash. That night I couldn't sleep. Jenna's words played on a loop in my head. Her regrets, her excuses, her pleas. A part of me wanted to believe she was sincere. That she really was sorry and would change if I let her back into my life. But another part of me, the stronger part, knew better. She wasn't sorry she cheated. She was sorry she got caught. If I hadn't exposed her, she would have kept lying, kept sneaking around, kept betraying me. As I lay there in the dark, I realized something important. I didn't need her apology. I didn't need her to fix anything. What I needed was to let go. So the next morning I went to the trash can, pulled out her letter and burned it. The paper curled and blackened in the flame, her words reduced to ash. It felt symbolic, in a way cleansing. Final. When the last ember faded, I stood there, staring at the empty tray. I wasn't fully healed. The pain was still there, lingering like a dull ache. But for the first time I felt like I was moving forward. This was my life now, and it was up to me to make it something worth living. Burning the letter felt like a release, but moving on wasn't as simple as flipping a switch. There were days when the anger would creep back in, and nights when the memories of Jenna's betrayal played on repeat in my mind. But I told myself it was part of the process. Healing wasn't linear, and as much as I hated to admit it, I still cared about her in some distant, conflicted way. To keep my mind occupied, I threw myself into building a new routine. I started waking up early, going for long walks around town before the streets filled with people. The quiet gave me time to think, or not think depending on the day. The park near my apartment became my go-to spot, a place where I could sit and watch the world go by without feeling the weight of everything for a little while. I also found a part-time job at a hardware store on the edge of town. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady and it kept me busy. The manager, Rick, was an older guy with a gruff demeanor but a good heart. He didn't pry into my life and I appreciated that. The simplicity of stocking shelves and helping customers felt like exactly what I needed, something straightforward, something I could control. One afternoon, while I was rearranging a shelf of screws and nails, an elderly woman approached me, struggling to carry a heavy box of garden tools. Without thinking, I rushed over to help her, taking the box from her hands. "Oh, thank you, young man," she said with a smile. "These old arms aren't what they used to be." "No problem," I replied, carrying the box to her car. She chatted as we walked, telling me about her garden, and how she was planning to surprise her granddaughter with some flowers they'd plant together. Her warmth was infectious, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I found myself smiling, genuinely smiling. As I shut the trunk of her car, she turned to me and patted my hand. "You're a good one," she said. "Don't let the world make you bitter." Her words hit harder than she probably realized. I stood there for a moment after she drove away, her kindness lingering in the air. It was such a small interaction, but it reminded me that not everyone was out to hurt or betray. There were still good people out there, and maybe I could be one of them. About a month after moving in, I stopped by the diner again for lunch. I had fallen into the habit of eating there a couple of times a week, partly because the food was good, but mostly because the staff had started to feel familiar. The waitress, Linda, always greeted me with a warm smile and a fresh cup of coffee, and the regulars would nod in recognition when I walked in. That day, the place was quieter than usual. I took a seat at the counter, and Linda poured me my usual coffee. As she set the cup down, she tilted her head, studying me for a moment. "You've got a different air about you today," she said. "You seem lighter." I shrugged, not sure how to respond. "Maybe I'm just getting used to things." She smiled knowingly. "Good. You deserve some peace." As I ate, a young woman walked in, her arms full of books and a tote bag slung over her shoulder. She glanced around, looking slightly out of place, before settling into a booth near the window. Linda went over to take her order, and I couldn't help but notice how nervous she seemed, like she was bracing for something. When Linda came back, she leaned over the counter. "That one's new," she said, nodding toward the woman. "She just moved here last week. Seems sweet but quiet. Maybe she needs a friend." I laughed softly. "You playing matchmaker now, Linda?" She grinned. "Not everything's about romance, honey. Sometimes people just need someone to sit with them and make the world feel a little less lonely." Her words stuck with me as I finished my meal. When I got up to leave, I hesitated for a moment, glancing toward the woman by the window. She was flipping through a book, her brow furrowed in concentration. Something about her reminded me of myself, someone trying to find their place again. I didn't say anything to her that day. But as I walked out of the diner, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe Linda was right. Maybe it was time to stop hiding and start letting people in again, one step at a time. The next time I stopped by the diner, I noticed her again, the woman from the booth near the window. She was there with the same stack of books, her head bent low as she scribbled notes into a journal. I sat at the counter, sipping my coffee and pretending not to notice her. But part of me couldn't help but wonder what her story was. What had brought her to this quiet town? Linda noticed me glancing in her direction. "Go talk to her," she said, her voice low but teasing. I shook my head. "She looks busy. I don't want to bother her." Linda smirked. "You never know. She might be waiting for someone to bother her." Before I could argue, Linda walked over to the woman's booth, gesturing toward me. I froze, watching as the woman looked up, her brow furrowing in confusion. Then Linda said something I couldn't hear, and the woman glanced in my direction, offering a hesitant smile. Great, I thought. "Thanks, Linda." When Linda came back to the counter, she placed a hand on her hip. She said you're welcome to join her if you're feeling brave. I hesitated, my instinct to stay in my shell warring with a small, unexpected surge of curiosity. Finally I stood, taking my coffee with me as I walked over to her table. "Mind if I sit?" I asked. She smiled, still a little unsure but welcoming. "Go ahead." Her name was Rachel, and as we talked, I learned that she'd recently moved to town to take a teaching position at the local high school. She taught English, which explained the stack of books and the journal. She had grown up in a big city but had decided she needed a change, a quieter place, she said, to find herself again. "I guess I'm kind of doing the same thing," I admitted. "I grew up here, but it's been years since I've been back. Felt like the right time to hit reset." Rachel nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It's not easy starting over. But sometimes it's the only thing you can do, right?" "Yeah," I said, surprised by how much her words resonated. "That's exactly it." Our conversation flowed easily after that. We talked about books, the quirks of small-town life, and the challenges of finding your footing in a new place. She had a dry sense of humor that caught me off guard, and for the first time in what felt like forever I found myself laughing, not out of politeness but because I actually felt good. By the time we finished talking, the diner had started to fill up with the lunch crowd. Rachel glanced at her watch and let out a small laugh. "I should probably get going. My lesson plans aren't going to write themselves." "Yeah, of course," I said, standing as she gathered her things. "It was nice talking to you." "You too," she said, smiling. Then, after a pause, she added, "Maybe I'll see you around?" "Yeah," I said, a small smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. "Maybe you will." As I watched her leave, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, a spark of possibility. It wasn't about romance or anything like that, at least not yet. It was about connection. About opening myself up to the world again, one conversation, one small moment at a time. The next few weeks were steady. I settled further into my routine, work at the hardware store, evenings spent on my balcony, and regular stops at the diner. Linda teased me every time I walked in, but it was good-natured. She'd always throw in a comment about how Rachel was a nice girl or how you should at least be friends. I didn't push back too much. If I was being honest with myself, I didn't mind the idea. Rachel and I crossed paths a few more times. At first it was just a wave or a brief hello when I saw her at the diner. Then one day as I was leaving work, I ran into her at the local bookstore. She was thumbing through a rack of used novels, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Still building that library?" I asked, surprising myself by initiating the conversation. She looked up, smiling when she saw me. "Always. You can never have too many books, right?" I chuckled. "Depends on how much shelf space you've got." "Fair point," she said, holding up a dog-eared copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. "What about this one? A classic or overrated?" "A classic," I said without hesitation. "One of my favorites." She raised an eyebrow. "You're a fan of Harper Lee?" "Who isn't?" Rachel smiled, her eyes softening. "You might be the first person I've met here who reads more than the sports section." "Well, don't give me too much credit," I said. "I'm not exactly devouring novels every week." "Still, it's nice," she said. "Most people don't get it." I could tell she wasn't just talking about books. There was something deeper in her words, something familiar. That longing for connection, for understanding. After the bookstore, we ended up walking together for a while. She lived not far from my apartment, in a small rental near the high school. The conversation flowed easily, just like it had at the diner. She talked about her students, the challenges of teaching in a small town, and her plans to start a book club. I told her about working at the hardware store and how I was still adjusting to being back. "I didn't think I'd like it here," she admitted as we strolled down a quiet street. "But it's growing on me. It's peaceful." "Yeah," I said. "There's something about the quiet that forces you to think about things. Sometimes that's good, sometimes not so much." Rachel nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I know what you mean. I think that's why I came here, to figure some things out. To get away from everything." I didn't press her for details. I recognized that look, the hesitation of someone carrying their own scars. I wasn't ready to share my story yet either. When we reached her place, she paused at the gate, turning to me with a smile. "Thanks for walking with me. It was nice." "Yeah," I said, shoving my hands into my pockets. "It was." She hesitated for a moment, like she wanted to say more, but instead she just waved. "See you around?" "Definitely," I said, watching as she disappeared inside. Walking back to my apartment, I felt something different, something I hadn't felt in months. It wasn't quite happiness, but it was close. A sense of possibility, of hope. For so long, my world had been defined by Jenna's betrayal, by anger and loss. But for the first time, it felt like there might be something beyond that. I wasn't ready to jump into anything new, and I wasn't sure if Rachel was either. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe this wasn't about rushing into another relationship, or filling the void Jenna had left. Maybe it was about rebuilding myself, piece by piece, one connection at a time. As I climbed the stairs to my apartment, I glanced up at the night sky. The stars were bright, the air crisp and cool. It wasn't much, but it felt like the start of something. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. Life didn't change overnight, but it started to shift in subtle, meaningful ways. My world, once so small and suffocating, began to open up little by little. The weight of Jenna's betrayal still lingered. Some wounds don't heal quickly, but it no longer consumed me. I wasn't just the man she hurt anymore. I was becoming someone new. Rachel and I started crossing paths more often, almost like the universe had decided we needed each other. It wasn't always planned. Sometimes I'd run into her at the diner or the bookstore, and we'd share a quick conversation. Other times it was intentional, a coffee here, a walk there. We never called them dates, but there was an unspoken understanding that we enjoyed each other's company. One crisp Saturday morning, Rachel invited me to the park. She brought a blanket, a couple of books, and a thermos of coffee. We sat under a large oak tree, flipping through pages and sharing passages we loved. It was the kind of quiet companionship I hadn't realized I needed. At one point she looked over at me and smiled. "You seem lighter." "Do I?" I asked, caught off guard. She nodded. "Yeah. Like you're finally letting yourself breathe." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just smiled back and let her words settle in. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was finally letting go of the heaviness I'd carried for so long. One evening, weeks later, I found myself sorting through the last box I'd brought from the old house. Most of it was junk, old receipts, random tools, a few photo albums. I flipped through the pages, lingering on the pictures of Jenna and me. Our wedding day. Vacations. Laughing together at some party I barely remembered. I felt a pang of sadness, but it wasn't the gut-wrenching kind I'd felt before. It was quieter, more reflective. This was my past, and while it wasn't all bad, it wasn't my future either. I took the albums and set them aside. Later, I'd decide what to do with them. For now, it was enough to close the box and tuck it away in the corner of the closet. Out of sight, out of mind, but not forgotten. Healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning to live with it. A few days later, Rachel invited me to her book club's first meeting. It was a small group, just a handful of people gathered in the library's cozy back room. We discussed To Kill a Mockingbird, the book she'd picked out after our conversation at the bookstore. As the group talked, I found myself watching Rachel. She was animated, passionate, her love for literature shining through in every word. There was something magnetic about her, something that made me feel like I could finally step out of the shadows I'd been hiding in. After the meeting, as we walked out into the cool night air, Rachel turned to me. "I'm glad you came tonight." "Me too," I said honestly. "It was good." She smiled, and for a moment we just stood there, the silence between us comfortable and warm. Then, without overthinking it, I reached for her hand. She looked at me in surprise, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she squeezed my hand lightly, her smile widening. It wasn't a grand gesture, and it wasn't a promise of anything more than what we already had. But it was enough, a small step forward, a sign that maybe, just maybe, I was ready to let someone in again. Life wasn't perfect, and it probably never would be. But as I walked Rachel home that night, her hand in mine, I realized that was okay. The scars Jenna left on me would always be there, but they didn't have to define me. I was more than the pain, more than the betrayal. I was someone who could heal, who could grow, who could find joy again in the little things. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of what came next. I was ready to keep moving forward.